Now, in this final week of our message series on the movement, we're going to look at two passages of Scripture. Both of these passages describe encounters that Peter had with Jesus. Peter was one of the disciples. He's one of the apostles of the early church. And the first passage that we're going to look at is from Matthew 16. It's actually the passage that we, that we looked at when we started this series. And the second passage we're going to look at is from John chapter 21. Now, the first passage that we're going to look at comes in the heart of Jesus' ministry. It's where Peter recognizes who Jesus is, the Messiah and the Son of God. And the second passage occurs towards the end of the gospel account about Jesus, and it's Peter's interaction with Jesus after the resurrection has occurred, after Jesus has died on the cross, and it's his encounter with the risen Christ. But both of these passages reinforce the central call of the movement, and that is the call to follow the leader of the movement, who is Jesus Christ. So as we conclude this message series with this final message, this particular message is simply titled, Follow the Leader. And if you're able, I invite you to stand to honor the reading of God's word. We're going to read from Matthew 16 and then move on to John chapter 21. So from Matthew 16, and this will be verses 13 through 18, and then we'll move on to verses 21 to 25. So starting with verse 13. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of death, or the gates of Hades, will not overcome it." And skipping to verse 21, from that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord," he said, "this shall never happen to you." Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it." And then skipping over to John chapter 21, this is the encounter that Jesus has with Peter after the resurrection, and they're in the middle of a conversation. And Jesus asks Peter a third time. He says, a third time, he said to Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted, but when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. And skipping to 21, when Peter saw him, he asked, "Lord, what about him?" And Jesus answered, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me." You may be seated. Now, if you're like me, one of the reasons why this series has been so engaging, it has really challenged us to re-examine some traditional understandings of what church is like, what we think about church. And sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words. So I want to start off by drawing two different pictures of what church can be like, maybe pictures that we can think of when we think about church. And we're going to do something a little bit new. We have these easels up. So in this first picture, you can think of this landscape as the world. And we can think of the church as kind of carved out of the world, and it's represented by this circle. So this is the world, this is the church, and at the center of the church is Jesus. Okay. And when we think about the church in this way, what it means for the church to grow or for people to become followers of Jesus means that they come from the world and they come into the circle. And what it means for them to kind of grow as Christians is that they become closer and closer to Jesus and closer to the center of this circle. Now, every representation has some good things and some things about it, some good things and some limitations about it. And this has some pretty significant limitations. Right? It's one way to think about the church, but it's not the only way. And some of the limitations of this model is that if you look at it in this way, one of the problems is that Jesus is really, really far from the world. He's about as far from the world as he can be. And in fact, the church kind of exists to insulate Jesus from the world. And then a second kind of problem is that as people grow closer and closer to Jesus, they get farther and farther from engaging with the world. And in a sense, they get less and less relevant to the world. So when the world kind of, sees the church functioning in this way, the world comes up with these caricatures of what Christians are like. And if you're my age, you might think of representations like Ned Flanders or the church lady from Saturday Night Live. And you have these pictures of Christians that are basically kind of weird, holier than thou, and basically people that you wouldn't want to spend any time with. Now, one other kind of problem with this model is that this is basically a static model of church. Like Jesus is at the center, but he's not moving. He's not engaging with the world. He's basically a fixed point. And so as we get closer and closer to Jesus, we basically get closer and closer to a fixed point, and then there's really nothing else for us to do. So there are some things that are relevant about this model, but it shouldn't be the only one that we think about when we think about church. And I want to suggest that when we think about church, we should at least be as serious about thinking or picturing a different model. And this model is represented by something that looks a little bit like this. Now, it's not intended to be a greater than sign. It's intended to be a picture of movement. You might think of it as the light shining into the darkness. You can think about this as the world and this as the church. And basically, there's a movement of the church engaging with the world. Another way that you can think about it is maybe that this is an arrow. It's the point of an arrow engaging in the world, or the tip of a spear, or a cavalry charge coming into the world. And now, I know a lot of that language is a little bit militaristic. I don't mean for it to be militaristic, but the reality is that there is a conflict between God's movement and the redemption of this world motivated by God's love and the systems of brokenness and sin that are present in this world. Now, let me give 3 quick examples. One of the things that has been in the news in a significant way is the health challenges that are occurring because of Ebola and other diseases. And one of the realities is that there are many parts of the developing world where, because of poverty and because of lack of access to education and other systems of oppression, access to basic health care is practically non-existent or is very difficult to access. And in many parts of the developing world, a huge part of the systems of healthcare are supplemented by Christians who are there providing basic care primarily because it's an expression of God's love and the reality that every single person in this world matters to God. So there are Christian medical professionals who are making it a priority with either part of their time or with their entire lives to be able to use the gifts that God has given them to care for others because of what God has done in their lives and the reality of God's love. Okay? Another example might be this summer I had a chance to visit with one of my good friends from college who works for an organization called International Justice Mission. And IJM, International Justice Mission, is an organization where there are legal professionals, like former district attorneys and other amazing lawyers, coupled with former law enforcement, coupled with social workers and other social service professionals. And they are working all over the world in areas where the systems of justice are broken. And they're fighting movements of sex trafficking and child slavery, and they are engaging with the skills that God has given them to combat injustice with God's justice and God's love. And there is an active engagement that is occurring. A third way that we can think about it historically is movements like the Civil Rights Movement, where the Civil Rights Movement here in America was really built and energized by the strength of black churches throughout the South. And so when we think about this model, we think about it as a model of engagement, and the reality is Jesus is at the very tip of this spear, that wherever justice and injustice are coming into conflict, Jesus is there. Wherever sickness and death is coming into conflict with healing and compassion, Jesus is there. Wherever there is despair and oppression and there's liberation that's coming in, Jesus is there. Jesus is on the move, engaging this world, and he's leading a movement and calling his church to come with him. And so if we think about our role in this movement, as we seek to grow closer and closer to Jesus, we come closer and closer to the front lines. And we're not just talking about international movements, but we have opportunities to participate in this kind of movement of God all over the world, including locally through any number of means. And we have people within this community that are engaging in movements just like this to express the love of God where there are needs. Now, the other thing that I like about this movement, about this picture, is that it's an expression that Jesus is on the move. He's not static or still. And because he is leading this movement of God's love and redemption, if we want to follow Jesus, we need to move also. We can't be still because Jesus is going to leave us behind. All right? So when we think about pictures of what the church is like, the church is not intended just to be this bubble that exists, this kind of holy huddle, or where there's a sharp boundary between the church and the world. But it's intended to reflect the reality that God is on the move and engaging this world, and we have an opportunity to come alongside and participate with him. So when we think about these pictures, we are turned back to the passages that we read today. And these two passages, Matthew chapter 16 and John chapter 21, are pivotal interactions between Peter and Jesus. And in both passages, Jesus is emphasizing the same thing. He's saying, Peter, if you want your life to count, if you want to align your life with God's purposes and God's plan and the movement of God, you need to follow me. Follow me as the leader of the movement. Now, when we hear the words, follow me, because of the kind of age that we live in, we may not think that it's that big of a deal. This kind of came across my radar. I looked it up. The person who has the most Twitter followers currently is, people know, Katy Perry, with 57 million people following her on Twitter. Now, to follow someone on Twitter just takes a single click, and then there's really no commitment on your part beyond that. But when Jesus tells Peter to follow him, he means something very different. And in the first century context, to follow someone means to make it your life's priority, to learn from them, to serve them, to imitate them, to become like them. And in these two passages, when Jesus invites Peter to follow him, we see two significant challenges to following. And Jesus doesn't minimize these challenges at all. I appreciate it so much. So in this remainder of this message, we want to learn from Peter and look at what these challenges are to following Jesus and how we can work through them. So the first major challenge is that following Jesus is costly, and it involves suffering and sacrifice. And Jesus doesn't pull any punches or hide this at all. Notice that in Matthew 16, verse 16, when Peter recognizes who Jesus is, and he says that you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God, Jesus doesn't say, finally, you got it. You know who I am. You're all done now. You can stay with me if you want, but if you want to go back home and be a fisherman, that's great too. You've made it. What Jesus makes clear to Peter is that his profession of faith wasn't the finish line, it was just the starting point. Did you get that? His profession of faith wasn't the finish line, it wasn't the end goal, it was just the starting point. And that following Jesus is far more than just recognizing or acknowledging who he is. And so immediately after Peter makes his profession, Jesus starts to teach that as the Messiah, he will need to go to Jerusalem, suffer at the hands of the chief priests and teachers of the law, and be killed. And then Jesus gives this kicker: whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. Now, perhaps we're tempted to think, well, maybe Jesus said this because he hadn't gone to Jerusalem yet, and he hadn't been arrested, he hadn't died on the cross yet, so he hadn't gone through that suffering yet. And maybe after all of that occurs, maybe on the other side of Easter, it'll be easier to follow Jesus because Jesus will have gone through all of that. But in John chapter 21, Peter meets Jesus on the shores of Galilee after the resurrection, after Jesus has died on the cross. And instead of changing the message, Jesus reinforces it. And he says, very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Basically, Jesus gave Peter a picture of what his execution was going to look like. And then he said to him, follow me. Now, when we hear this, I think we probably feel a little bit like Peter must have felt in Matthew 16. You see, Peter had a very different outcome in mind when Peter recognized Jesus as the Messiah and the Son of the living God. In the first century, the most clear conception of who the Messiah was going to be was a spiritual and military hero, a conquering leader that would kick the Romans out of Israel, that would establish a new and free nation, that would lead it into a time of prosperity, that would reestablish the Davidic kingship and would reign in glory. And Peter wants to follow that kind of Messiah, because that kind of Messiah would be reigning in glory, and some of that glory would rub off on Peter's life. But a Messiah who suffers, a Messiah who is killed, following this kind of Messiah isn't compatible with Peter's own sense of his own dreams and hopes and goals. And that's why when Peter hears Jesus talking about going to Jerusalem and suffering and dying, Peter in Matthew 16:22 takes Jesus aside and rebukes him and says, never, Lord, this will never happen to you. And what Peter is essentially saying is, I don't want this to happen to you, and I certainly don't want this to happen to me. Right? I don't want you to suffer, and I don't want me to suffer. And we may think that Peter is quite bold in rebuking Jesus, but the reality is, what kind of hopes and dreams do we have that we expect God to help to bring to pass? What do we hope that God will do for us as we follow him? Or what plans do we have with our lives that we really don't want God to mess with in any way? You know, I think in our heart of hearts, it's easy for us to revise the call of Jesus to follow him, and we make a subtle change to it, and practically the way that we live it out makes it become something a little bit more like carpooling with him. You know, when we carpool with someone, we travel with someone out of mutual benefit and convenience, right? If you're going in the same general direction that I'm going and we can help each other out, then we're great to carpool. And one of the great joys of carpooling is flying in the carpool lane and all the other lanes are jammed up and still, right? Like, I'm not the only one that feels a thrill when that happens, right? But when the place that you're going takes me too far out of my way, when it stops being convenient or beneficial to the goals and the destination that I have, then it's time for me to find a place to drop you off, to tell you about Uber and help you get connected so that you can get to where you want to go and I can get to where I want to go. But Jesus isn't inviting us to carpool. He says to us, I'm leading a movement to redeem this world. And I invite you to follow me. I call you to follow me, to be a part of it. But it involves letting go of some of your own dreams. It's going to involve some pain and sacrifice and suffering. And that's a real challenge for us. None of us wants to suffer. There's a second major challenge, and it's found right in John chapter 21, verse 21. Jesus has just told Peter that he's going to face death by execution. And in this incredible picture of human nature, Peter is walking, and he glances behind him, and he sees another disciple trailing, and he goes, what about him? And what Peter is really saying is, why me? Why do I have to die in this way? What about him? It's not fair. And any parent knows that this is a perfect picture of human nature. You can see it at work in 5 seconds if you come over to my house this afternoon and you try doing something like giving my 2 daughters 2 differently sized scoops of ice cream. Within a nanosecond, you will hear out of their mouths, how come, what about them, why me? It's not fair. The reality is, as humans, we have a highly attuned sense of justice when it comes to feeling like we're not being treated fairly. And one of the things that can make it challenging for us to follow Jesus is that, even for those of us here who are Christians, we look at other Christians and we ask questions like, how come they get to follow Jesus in that way and it looks like their lives are so much better off than mine? How come they get to follow Jesus and not be called to sacrifice in the ways that I'm feeling called to sacrifice? How come they get to follow Jesus and they're not suffering in the ways that I feel like God is calling me to suffer? What about them? Why me? It's not fair. I particularly resonate with this second challenge of following Jesus. The reality is God calls different people to different things. And so what it looks like for each of us to follow Jesus is not going to look like the same thing. It's going to look different. And I've wrestled with this why me question ever since I was in college, when I was a new Christian, and I felt like God was calling me into something that looked like vocational ministry or being a pastor. And I didn't want it. I remember being in worship settings just like this one, and in my heart, yelling at God and saying, God, all I want is a comfortable life. I hear these messages about the cost of following you, and I don't want to be convicted. I just want something nice and secure. I was looking at other Christians who had a real sense to integrate their faith with professional success, and I couldn't understand why God wasn't calling me and giving me peace to move in the same direction. God, just call me to be a high-powered professional. Why do you seem to be calling me in a different direction? Why me? What about them? It's not fair. And it's not always about work. For some of us, we're single. We're seeing a lot of our friends who are getting married or who are married. And we ask, why me? Perhaps we've struggled with infertility. We see a lot of the other people that we know, the other families that we know with kids, and we think, why me? Or perhaps we have a child and our child was born with special needs, and we think, God, why have you placed this special burden on our family? Why me? Why can't my life turn out nice and apparently free of suffering like the other people that I see around me? And I've been around the block long enough now to know that even people who are, quote unquote, highly empowered professionals feel the burden of what it looks like to live out their faith in that context. And they can ask, just like we all ask, when God calls us to follow him, there's a special call that involves sacrifice and cost, and we can all ask, why me? Why not some other person? These are two big challenges. None of us wants to suffer. None of us wants to let go of our own dreams or plans or goals for ourselves. And when God calls us to follow him and says that the road will be hard and it'll involve sacrifice, and maybe he gives us a kind of a sense of call and vision for our lives that involves a special burden or a special cost that we have to bear, we're tempted to ask, what about them? Why me? It doesn't seem fair. These two challenges to following Jesus can seem insurmountable. And the reality is, they are insurmountable, humanly speaking. We don't have the capacity to follow Jesus wholeheartedly unless. You see, something allowed Peter to follow Jesus, not perfectly, but faithfully to the very end of his life, in spite of the picture of his execution. And in Matthew 16, when Peter first receives this call to follow Jesus, he isn't able to do it. When Jesus gets arrested, when he gets captured by the authorities in Jerusalem, Peter bails. He abandons Jesus. He denies him 3 times. He's too afraid of the personal cost of what is going to happen to him to follow. But something happened by the time we get to John chapter 21. Jesus gives the same call, and Peter is still human. He struggles with the same challenges. But if you look at the rest of the story, you'll see that Peter is able to follow. And here's the key thing that changed. In Matthew chapter 16, when Peter is thinking about God's movement and Jesus as the Messiah and what Jesus has come to do, the idea of Jesus rescuing and redeeming was purely for other people. But by John chapter 21, Peter has realized that God's movement in this world and Jesus' life and ministry was first and foremost about saving Peter. You see, by John chapter 21, Peter knew that the suffering that Jesus endured on the cross was first and foremost so that Peter himself could be forgiven, that Peter himself could be brought into God's family. Peter himself could be reconciled with God and granted everlasting life. By John chapter 21, Peter realized, he knew for certain how desperately he needed God, how broken and faithless he was apart from God. And when Jesus met Peter and restored him. John chapter 21. Peter realized the amazing depth, the breadth, and the height of God's love for him. And he realized that what he had most feared, that what he had most resisted, the act of Jesus as the Messiah dying on the cross, was actually what he most needed. That it wasn't a story gone wrong, but it was a concrete act of God's love and grace and mercy for him. When God's love and grace became personal for Peter, it melted Peter's heart. And if Jesus was willing to die for him, then Peter realized that he would be willing to suffer for the sake of others. And Peter realized that this question of why me no longer really applied, because God had been unfair, but unfair in Peter's favor. That's what grace means. It's favor that isn't earned or deserved in any way. It's not a matter of fairness, it's a matter of grace. And with that realization, Peter could stop asking, why me and what about them? And to realize that Jesus' invitation to be a part of this movement, to be a part of what he was doing in this world, wasn't an invitation and a call out of obligation, but it was a call out of God's incredible love and grace. That to say yes to Jesus and to follow him was a privilege. And Peter was able to say yes to following Jesus. So what about us here today? Do we recognize the parts of our lives where right now we're just so focused on the cost of following Jesus? Or we feel like what God has put on our hearts, it just isn't fair, why he would call us in a particular way. And we're asking those questions of why me and what about them? And feeling like it's not fair. Where do we need to be reminded that the same Jesus who's asking us to follow him is the same Jesus who's already forgiven us and saved us and redeemed us and brought us into God's family. It's the same Jesus who has promised us, you and me, that he will never leave us or forsake us, and that his love for us is an everlasting love that we can never lose. And in light of all that God has done for us, we remember that he's in the process of redeeming others and redeeming this world in the same way. And we're invited to join in that movement. We have the privilege of following Jesus and saying yes to him. And the Bible reminds us that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. If God has been unfair, he's been unfair in our favor. And we have the opportunity to live our lives following Jesus in gratitude for all that he has done. So we've looked at this movement of Jesus. We've looked at how Jesus is on the move, and if we want to follow Jesus, we need to move too. We need to draw close to him and be a part of the work that he is doing.